Since Washington's inception, Olympia has been its capital. But why? It's not the first, third, or even 10th largest city in Washington. It's the 24th, with a population of only 50,000, and yet it remains the political hub of the entire state. But why was it originally chosen to be the capital? And how did it manage to keep its spot? Well, I'm gonna tell you. When most people think of cities in Washington, they think of Seattle. And that's for good reason. It is by far the largest city in the entire state, and most certainly the economic capital, and to the chagrin of Eastern Washington, also probably the cultural capital. And if we base it off that, it seems like Seattle should be the capital of Washington. But for some reason it's Olympia. Even when you Google search it, one of the top results for why is Olympia the capital of Washington is instead, why is Seattle not the capital of Washington? Well, that can pretty simply be answered, but to do it, we're going to have to go all the way back to 1853, when the Washington Territory, not state, separated from the Oregon Territory. In 1853, Olympia was the hub of Washington. And so, when the new territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, showed up, he chose Olympia, and for good reason. Olympia had around a population of about 100, which is about as big as towns in Washington got at the time, and in addition to being the end of the Cowlitz Trail, which was an important settler trail up the Pacific Northwest, and having nearby coal mines, it was certainly a perfect choice for this capital of Washington. And for Seattle, it was smaller and pretty much just a backwater along the coast. Now, that's kind of why Olympia became the capital, but as you might notice, this video is far from over, because a lot would happen for Olympia to hold its spot into the modern era. In 1860, Vancouver, a city south of Olympia, and not to be confused with the Vancouver in British Columbia, attempted to become the capital of Washington. And it had some merit. It was one of the largest cities in all of Clark County, which was the largest county in Washington at the time. Even today, Vancouver is almost 4 times the size of Olympia. And in 1860, legislators managed to sneak through a bill in the Washington Congress that would allow for Vancouver to become the capital. And that would have been the end of the story right there. Boom. The capital would have been moved to Vancouver, and I wouldn't be making this video. Or maybe I would if more interesting things had happened. But that didn't happen. Because that bill, they forgot to add the words, "be it enacted," to the front. Now, most people, especially the ones in Clark County that wanted it, were like, wow, that's dumb. Let's just ignore that and move on with the clearly legislative intent. The bill managed to reach the territory Supreme Court, though, and in a 2-1 decision, it was marked invalid. And while there was some half-hearted attempt to invalidate the invalidation by saying that the Supreme Court should have not been in Olympia, and it should have been the Vancouver Supreme Court that was able to legislate, because Vancouver should have been the capital by now. But that didn't really hold up, and this was kind of the end of their whole attempt. But before the Supreme Court had invalidated it, there had actually been a rump legislature that had developed in Vancouver, though most congressmen had chosen to stay in Olympia rather than go down to Vancouver when it was clearly not really going to happen. 1889 would mark another chance for Olympia to lose its title as capital. Washington was becoming a state, and with that, they did technically need to choose a state capital, as Olympia before now had just been the territory's capital. And while there were some attempts throughout 1887 and 1888 to choose a capital for Washington before it actually became a state, none of them came to pass, and it wouldn't be until 1889, when Washington was actually becoming a state, that legislators would put it up to a vote from the public. West of the Cascades, Olympia had pretty much tied up the vote. And yes, Seattle was there, and it was a decently sized city at this point, but no one was really campaigning for it. Central Washington was a very different story, though, as North Yakima, who is now called Yakima, I have a video about that, I'll probably put it at the end, as well as Ellensburg were both very strong contenders to take the state capital. There was fierce rivalry between these two cities, though, and local newspapers would get in an all-out war against each other, making for some very interesting anecdotes. My personal favorite being when they fought over how windy each other's cities were. I don't really know how that applies to being the capital much, but They clearly thought it was important. Unfortunately, though, in 1889, a fire would destroy much of Ellensburg, which kind of squandered its chances at becoming the capital. The rivalry between these two cities, though, wouldn't end, and they would refuse to vote for each other when the election finally came around, splitting the crucial Central Washington vote. The final results would put Olympia at 25,000 voters, whereas North Yakima would get 14,000 and Ellensburg 12,000. You want to do a quick math, you'd note that if Ellensburg and Yakima had put aside their differences and chosen one of them, Olympia wouldn't have made it. They didn't get a majority vote. As mentioned before, though, the vote was not a majority of Olympia, which meant another vote had to be cast among the top 3 cities. Olympia would anticlimactically absolutely destroy this election, getting 37,000 votes, the rest being split between Ellensburg and North Yakima, each garnering less votes than they did in the original election. That would be the last big attempt to change the capital from Olympia to some other city in Washington. The small city has weathered multiple attempts to dethrone it, but throughout its 160-year reign as Washington's capital, it hasn't budged. Thanks for watching. Did I miss something important, or maybe you have your hot take of why some other city should be the capital? Put it in the comments. And as always, if you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing.